Hi, my name is Franz Hartmann. I'm the coordinator of the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance. Welcome to Building Complete Neighborhoods with Gentle Density, the Portland example, a discussion of Portland's experience in building sustainable communities. First, let me begin with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that the land I am on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto, where I am, is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. These are lands that were meant to be shared with nature and in a way that honors the life that we have been given. The history of this land clearly demonstrates that we have not lived up to this intentional promise. To have hope for future generations, to have a sustainable world for them, we must recognize the value in each other, reconcile for past tragedies, and ensure compassionate care and concern for all. Further, we must recognize that the various components of our ecosystem, the air, land, water, flora, and fauna, are all interdependent and need to work in harmony. The only way forward is together. On behalf of the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance Steering Committee, including Ann Bell from Ontario Nature, Linda Lukasik from Environment Hamilton, and Kevin Thomason from the Grand River Environmental Network, who are joining us today, I would like to welcome you to today's seminar. Welcome back to those of you who have joined us for the first two webinars, or one of the first two webinars, and hello to those of you joining for the first time. For those of you not familiar with the OGA, we're a network of over 100 organizations, large and small, from across Ontario, but mostly within the Greater Golden Horseshoe, working together to protect and expand Ontario's world-famous Greenbelt. And one of the ways we do this is by working with community leaders, including elected officials and their staff, to find ways to use planning tools to help overcome key local challenges in a way that also helps the Greenbelt. In February and March, we held regional webinars aimed at helping local councillors, mayors, and municipal staff navigate the municipal comprehensive review process in a way that was also Greenbelt friendly. One of the recurring comments we got from participants was, we want webinars on solutions, specifically what we can do right now to make sustainable communities. And we heard you loud and clear, which is why we're here today. This is the third and final webinar in our series about solutions. The other two are now on our YouTube channel at Ontario Greenbelt Alliance. Today, of course, we're focusing on Portland and how they re-legalized middle housing, also known as gentle density. So let me introduce our expert guide for today, Michael Anderson. Michael covers housing and transportation for Sightline Institute, the Pacific Northwest sustainability think tank. He previously spent 10 years reporting on these issues as a journalist in Oregon and Washington, and he was closely involved in Oregon's 2019 passage of the first state-level fourplex legalization and Portland's 2020 legalization of fourplexes and mixed income sixplexes. Michael is going to start with a presentation followed by a Q&A. Feel free to pop questions into the chat function at any time, and I will get to them after Michael finishes. So now over to you, Michael.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Franz, and thanks to all of you for coming and the invitation to share some of what we found in here in Portland and Oregon. I'm based here in Portland on Chinook and Coast Salish land, and I am active somewhat in the other parts of our area of Sightline. I'll talk about that in a second. So I'm going to switch over to slides. Just a moment, please. Hopefully that's working out. Okay, cool. I am... so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we have done here in Oregon. I'm going to talk a little bit about lessons for helping other people appreciate the benefits of those actions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the way things that are and aren't working, I think, in our current code that we've got these recent revisions in. And I'd love to have some back and forth after that about any of the finer points that you'd like to get into. So, just to start with preface, who am I? What is Sightline? We're a regional sustainability think tank. We focus on anywhere the salmon can swim, is how my boss likes to put it sometimes. It goes across the national border into Canada, you can see, and across various state lines as well here in the United States. I focus on housing and transportation. It's our single biggest area of focus, but we have a bunch of different sort of angles on all the things it takes to make a healthy region. And one of those things, we think, is that cities are good. Cities of all sizes. This is downtown Hamilton from sometime around 1866 or so. You can see various things in this picture that I like jump out at me. One is this was all done, of course, long before we decided to make laws about who could build what, where, exactly, in what ways. And you can see how this follows sort of a natural pattern that there are some parts of town where people are clustering and living closer to their jobs, presumably, and some parts of town where they're further apart and specializing maybe in different jobs or maybe in different priorities. There's a variety of building types all scattered around. And that is not to say that everything about this picture is good. For one thing, just to choose one example, I'm glad I don't have to smell this picture, but I am often thinking in my work now about sort of how we can learn the lessons of the past and legalize the good parts of it. One reason that it's good to do so from our perspective as environmentalists is that cities save energy. This is one reason cities are good. This is a map of carbon emissions per household in the Portland metro area. You can guess where Portland is. It's the blue part in the middle. That's not politics, though it is politics, but it's also how much energy we are consuming per household. The two ways to be energy efficient are to, one, not have very much money. You would also see that if you knew the economics of this area. Or two, to live close to other people. And that's simply because the that's simply because the transportation costs and the building costs of living further from other people are greater. It's pretty intuitive. Another great thing about cities is they make us richer. They boost the economy. This is borne out in many, many studies. Here's one. I think main reason that why that's the case, at least this is my theory, is that they bring us together. Cities are where ideas go to make out. They're what happens when good ideas meet, people join in. When Proctor meets Gamble, in their case, both immigrants literally marrying their ideas together with their families, their brothers-in-law, and they came up with a new way to turn soap or to turn fat into soap, and then they created Cincinnati as we know it. So the cities that we create today are going to be the ones that bring in tomorrow's Proctors and Gambles, help them meet each other, help them share their ideas, and maybe even save the world. But the problem is that fewer and fewer of us sort of have an option to live in cities because the scarcity of our cities is expressed in the price of the homes in our cities. And we see this across national borders, across international borders. Everywhere, this is a problem in the rich world, basically. And many, many cities are trying to figure out how we can address this shortage amid all our abundance. One way that we can learn from the past to do this is by allowing people to share structures if they want to. This is an example. I think it's thought of as sort of like, people living close to each other is a very urban idea, but this is from a small town in Oregon. You would not know that this has multiple units in it unless you looked at the mailboxes. You can see this one is marked with A and the other one is hidden behind that pillar, but this is a 2-unit structure and it's one of many 2 to 4 unit structures scattered all across North America. These are all based on U.S. cities. I couldn't as easily turn up the comparable thing from Statistics Canada, but the gist of it across the states is that it's somewhere in the range of 10% of existing homes in U.S. cities is in structures of 2 to 4 units today. I looked up, I was able to pull up duplexes for Hamilton and for Canada as a whole. It's somewhere in the range of 2 to 3% just for duplexes. They don't break it out by 4 and 3plexes as much, but you get the idea. The reason for this is that these have been here since they were built before they were banned. I'm going to talk about that in a sec. I mentioned here middle housing is a bedrock of smaller cities' housing markets. Another way to think of it, maybe a Pacific Northwest way to think about it, is that it's the heartwood of smaller cities' housing markets. This is the old wood at the core of the tree, at the core of the housing market that's holding a lot of the housing market up. This is where lower middle class people are living in many of our cities today. But the problem is that because we aren't growing any more of it, we're letting it rot out. So part of what I'll be talking about today is the need to build more, to plant new trees, to start this middle housing growing again in the rich forest that we all want. What happened to the forest? This is a map of Portland, my hometown, and you can see every dot on this map is a 2 to 4plex. And you'll notice that there were parts of this town where the 2 to 4plexes are less common. And that is not a coincidence. That is because in 1924, those were the parts of town that banned 2 to 4plexes first when zoning was introduced in Portland. If you knew Portland, you would also know that this is the rich part of Portland. These are the richest neighborhoods in Portland, and those were the ones that led the trend. Of course, the fact that this was happening first in these rich neighborhoods, mostly by sort of local assent, and basically the city council wouldn't worry about it. If your neighborhood asked for it, they would give it to you. They would ban duplexes and everything else. And the effect of this was that it became a very high status thing to be able to brag that your neighborhood had banned duplexes, had, in other words, required everybody who shows up in the neighborhood to purchase a lawn. And they took it citywide. So in 1959, this rule was expanded to all of the city's low-density zones, banning duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, small apartment buildings, townhomes. And this is common in many cities in North America. In fact, just about all of them. Cities you have heard of. Common in Ontario. The message I bring to you today, though, is that this is changing. There is a movement across the continent that is gradually reversing this bad idea. We're legalizing duplexes again. This is one built about 20 years ago here in Portland. This is a fourplex built a few years ago. A backyard cottage or ADU. A cottage cluster up in Washington State. Backlot home. I think this is in Massachusetts. The problem with this trend is, as it's been happening bit by bit in all those structures, we've been doing piecewise upzones or allowances in many cities in the country. But if you think about the politics in any one city, my observation is that it's possible to move heaven and earth to get this stuff done at the city level. And as you can see, it varies by city. Here, these are the cities around Lake Washington in the Seattle area. And you can see that, Tukwila, one of the suburbs of Seattle, closer in suburb, has legalized quite a bit of attached housing. Seattle, also quite a bit. If you were to imagine that Tukwila were to be like, why do we make it illegal to have these lower cost housing units in our city? Especially in a situation where there's this overall shortage of housing over the last few decades, we are going to find the politics to change that. We're going to remove our bans on low density middle housing, right? Duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. And not only that, we're going to take the rush of property tax windfall that we would get from that sort of infill, and we would reapply it to ensure that we create a local voucher program to make sure that everybody gets a share in this city. Even if they did that, it would be a drop in the bucket of the problem, because they could not affect the overall regional shortage without the same action in Seattle and in Redmond and in Renton and in Bellevue. You need all these cities working together, like with so many environmental problems, to have the effect that you need. So in the absence of that full win condition, now it's not that there's no benefit to a city that does this. There are lots of benefits to a city to allow different options for its citizens, but there's a lot of costs too, and many of them are in politics. The cost, every politician is constantly considering about, what am I going to get out of this, and is it worth the trouble? And when you can't get the full benefits, there's not as much reason, even for those of us who believe in this, to go through the trouble. So that's the dilemma that many, many cities are facing. or at least part of it. A possible answer we've been pursuing at Sightline is about state and provincial government. What is the role of state and provincial government in helping solve this problem, helping bring cities back to the productive and welcoming versions that we know that they can be, and they have been in the past? One possible answer, one way to think about the answer, is working together, right? That's what government is for. It's for working together. When state and provincial governments help cities work together, we can all win. So that's what Oregon has done. In 2019, we legalized fourplexes at the state level, passed a law that requires cities to legalize fourplexes in all neighborhoods in the larger cities and throughout the Portland metro area, our largest city, and duplexes on any lot in cities, including fairly small, down to 10,000 population. As it's turned out, almost all cities have gone beyond the all neighborhoods mandate and just legalized fourplexes straight up on almost all lots. It's something I did not anticipate at all when this law passed. I thought cities would do as little as possible. They've actually gone beyond the law in various ways, including other ones I'll talk about in a bit. To think about what was necessary for this in Oregon, I always say the number one thing that was necessary, the most important thing, was that we had a committed leader in Tina Kotek, the Speaker of the House, currently a frontrunner for governor, and a former resident of a fourplex, a homeowner in a gentrifying neighborhood today. She decided this was going to be the way that the Oregon Democratic Party could address what was, she was willing to admit, an apparent broad shortage of housing without doing what the Oregon Republican Party has always wanted to do, which is to pave all the valleys of all the farmland and rivers throughout Oregon for subdivisions. So the Oregon Democratic Party said, oh no, okay, so we're no longer denying the existence of this shortage. We're going to come up with a different way to address this shortage. Other things required. Years of coalition building and public outreach. Speaking at the little megaphone there in the middle is Bandana Shrestha of AARP. Bandana specifically got religion on middle housing 10 or 15 years ago, and AARP across the United States has been a huge voice in support of this for the simple reason that it's great for older folks in particular to have lots of living options where they can live in community or with family or just, more affordably and accessibly in many cases. The core of our coalition here in Portland and in Oregon, I would say, was nonprofit housing developers. We found that nonprofit developers had the incentive, because they were often already building these homes. They had the expertise. They had the moral authority in many cases. To some extent, they had the capacity to think about what they could do if the zoning rules were better for lower cost housing. Here's an example. This is my colleague Madeline Kovacs is a younger woman in this picture, and she's standing with the head of the Oregon or the Portland Community Land Trust, Diane Lynn. This is Habitat for Humanity, one of the larger home builders in low density areas that works on affordable housing in most of the United States. And basically that's because they find that it's the least expensive homes to build. And so the more homes, the more lots where their housing type can be legal, the easier a time they have of creating those homes and bringing them into the lives of people without too much money. We were able to build lots of alliances that you might not expect to be working together, sitting at the same table. Here's a smattering of them. You can skim it a bit. But as Madeline, who sort of ran the politics for our campaign, often said to me, I was running the content for it, the gold standard in advocacy from her perspective was to get a bunch of people asking for the same thing for different reasons. And that was what she was able to mobilize among many interest groups. And many interest groups were independently working on sort of similar issues, seeing the connections, and once there was an opportunity to come together around a policy, were able to do so and express their support for it. Meanwhile, our opposition, this is Jane, just to use one example, talking about a big house that came in next to her house. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this stuff is annoying to a lot of people. It's annoying when other people are parking in the street in front of your house. It's never going to not be annoying for other people to park in the street in front of your house. The question is just how do we weight that against the many problems of banning different housing types from our neighborhoods? And so that was the debate we had basically with Jane and a lot of people who saw things the way she did, and there are legitimate points on both sides. One thing that we did when talking about this to try and capture the case for our policy was not to talk about what was going away or what we wanted to go away, single family zoning, but to talk about re-legalizing middle housing, talk about what we wanted to occur. We talked about the ways to redirect, rechannel society from these giant one-unit homes, which across the United States and Canada are becoming more and more and more common, and over into smaller attached homes. One way to do that was specific to the Portland policy was we set a maximum size on a new building. We set the smallest maximum size on a one-unit building and a slightly larger for a two-unit, slightly larger than that for a three-unit, and so on. One political effect of that was it made it easy for us to position ourselves against McMansions because we could say, okay, those huge homes that you may object to because they're large or maybe because they're ostentatious and you sort of have a natural discomfort with inequality that's manifesting in your feeling about these homes. We were against that. We actually want to ban them. If you think about the effect of mandating one-unit housing in most of our cities, it's to essentially mandate that every time a one-unit home reaches the end of its useful life in a growing area or a place with more and more demand, it's going to be replaced by a bigger one-unit home. And it's not that these homes on this block are like terrible places to be. I'm sure they're great, and every city should have some really nice homes, I think. But when that's the only thing that anybody's allowed to build in 70% of your city, it's going to eventually lead to people spending $500,000 or more to replace one house with one house. And that is not the most efficient use of capital, in my opinion. Another thing we did here in Portland is to root the story in our community-specific history. You heard me telling some of that story before. We found the specific years, 1924, 1959, and we talked about how that happened in our communities. You could talk about specific people who were involved. When you talk about the specific history of your community, you sort of leave behind the notion that single-family zoning is written on a tablet, which I think a lot of people today sort of have in their heads in one way or another, and towards the fact that this was a policy choice. This was a choice made essentially by our grandparents that banned the neighborhood that many of our grandparents grew up in. And I can understand making mistakes, right? It turns out that over the long term, over centuries, it's been a century since this happened, bad things can happen that you didn't anticipate. And so we're adjusting to that. We're reacting to those changes. Another thing that I always talk about every chance I can is to show, not tell. We do not let anybody encounter these ideas without also, hopefully, having them encounter a photo of the kind of homes that we think should be legal. So for that reason, Sightline put together this free photo library on Flickr for anybody to use with or without permission to put to whatever use they can. If you have your own photos, we would love to add them to it. Messengers are crucially important in all this stuff. I mentioned the role that nonprofit housing developers played in this. Here's an example. This was a news article that ran right before the vote on Oregon's middle housing bill. And here's the head of the local Habitat chapter talking about how this would be great. If any of this interests you, Sightline has a memo that we circulated to allies when this bill was introduced. You can get it at that first bit.ly link, and our housing research in general. You get maybe one email a month with our latest stuff along these and other lines. If you can go and get emails on that at Sightline sign up. And I'll share these links too later. Good news out of Oregon that followed was that House Bill 2001 passed. A few things to notice about these charts. One, you can see in the states we use red for Republicans, blue for Democrats. We needed a bipartisan support in both houses despite massive Democratic supermajorities in Oregon. There were enough Democrats who were not willing to vote even for the high priority bill of the Speaker of the House on this high priority issue that we couldn't have done it without Republican support. And fortunately, Representative Kotek had built the alliances necessary for that, and it happened, in part because of support from the home builders and realtors associations, among other things. At the local level, I mentioned how once the state moved in to sweep away the status quo, to say, no, you're not allowed to keep things the way they are. You have to abandon the idea that before achieving change, you need to please everybody. What do you actually want to do? What is your ideal policy? The status quo is not working. So once that was swept away, taken off the table, once the loss aversion, I think, was reduced, then Portland, and many other cities in Oregon, actually got to go beyond the state's requirements, made a bunch of smart changes. So this image summarizes a bunch of them. It's by Alfred Twu, who's an illustrator out of California. You can see on the left side of this image the reduced minimum building sizes created and how there's this sliding scale down from the oneplexes that were previously allowed. We also allowed cottage clusters and put in an accessibility mandate with the third home. The one of the more interesting things that came up in Portland was that there was much discussion about what is this going to do for regulated affordable housing? Like, is there going to be some extra action that's going to help specifically poor people live in newly built homes? That's a huge, totally legitimate problem. Portland came up with an interesting solution. We looked at the math and concluded that when you allow more homes per lot, you save money because more households can split up the land cost, essentially. That's what's going on. So increasing the number of units allowed on a lot is the mathematical equivalent of writing a big check to every home, but it doesn't cost anything to the government, which means that every dollar the government does spend is going to go farther if you can allow this. So with that in mind, we looked at these buildings that were going up on a few of the higher density lots in Portland, and we said, why couldn't we do that on any lot if it met affordability standards? The city council agreed, and so that was built into the Portland law as well. After Oregon passed its middle housing bill, its first middle housing bill, it's sort of been like a dam has broken in the conversations about this. I think once the cities and people realized that, like, no, this is something the state could do, this is something that state legislators should feel some responsibility to reduce the cost of building things, should think about the shortage in their votes. We had quite a bit of action in various laws in the last couple of years since then. This is one example, lot divisions for middle housing. It makes the whole middle housing universe much more fruitful by allowing ownership as well as rental options. Basically, you can drop a lot line down the middle of a triplex or a fourplex, for example, and then you can get 3 or 4 ownership units if you want. That passed overwhelmingly bipartisan support. Similarly, density bonuses, sort of along the lines of that sixplex thing that I mentioned in Portland. A law passed saying whatever your zoning is, it has to be a greater number of units allowed if they meet affordability standards. It's the equivalent of writing that low-cost check to regulated affordable housing. When this finally took effect last August, I did an exercise sort of running some back-of-the-envelope calculations with a local development consultant to see, well, which of these could work on sort of a generic lot in Portland, which could you do? We, after did a bunch of math, came up with a pretty simple answer. It's basically the ones that don't require demolition. It's not very economically efficient to knock down a perfectly good old home and replace it even with 3 or 4 new homes because you're wasting that perfectly good old home. The thing that works in more cases is to put housing where there isn't housing, to put it in an underused backyard or whatever, or to do an addition in some cases. So these are a few of those options that did work mathematically. A double ADU in the back was legalized. We legalized co-living by removing our restriction on sharing bedrooms, or on unrelated people sharing a larger house, basically. And we also legalized homes on wheels, including RVs in the backyard. So it's now legal to live in a utility-connected RV in the backyard, and you can do that for not very many dollars a month and have it still make a payoff for the property owner. So that's cool. I want to highlight a few things that Portland has done that are taking effect in just a couple of weeks to sort of further tweak these laws. I think are hopefully going to accelerate production going forward. This is a backlot home. I mentioned it earlier in the talk. This is from Massachusetts, and you can see these are detached structures. You can imagine how there are a lot of smaller homes. If they happen to be towards the front of the lot or even towards the back of the lot, it would be really nice if you could build another detached structure. It doesn't have to be small like a cottage. It could be the same size, whatever. Even better, what if you could drop a lot line down the middle of it and just sell off your backyard to somebody who wants to put a house on it? If that's okay with you, that's okay with them. That means, unlike with an ADU or cottage, you don't have to be a landlord. You just have to be a neighbor, right? That's a great way for people who find themselves land rich but cash poor to help themselves out of that dilemma, but also to address the housing shortage and maybe live in a community that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. I mentioned the state law that required the middle housing to be uh, allowed for ownership options. So that, this is an example to look at one of the triplexes. You can imagine here you could drop a lot line down the wall between each of these three homes and have three homes sold off separately. This could even work on a mid-block lot in Portland. So you can have the door sort of facing sideways, as it were, as long as there's an easement to walk up to the street and so on, and run the pipes back there underneath the sidewalk probably. The other thing that's required here, which you might notice, is for the city to no longer mandate special on-site parking for every single residential lot. Portland eliminated its parking mandates in all low-density zones and then effectively citywide. As part of this, you can still build parking if you want to. You just don't have to. You're no longer saying that parking is more important than housing, which is what the effect of a parking mandate does. This is the website of Oregon Homeworks is one of a handful of builders that are taking advantage of this new code. The guy who ran this company or runs this company today, he actually sat on the committee that redesigned Portland's zoning code. When he joined the committee, his objective was to stop this process. He wanted to prevent the changes that they were proposing. He wanted to make sure he could keep building his 1 million plus oneplexes because that was how he made money. And over the course of the next few years, he actually realized, no, wait, I can make money building lower cost homes too. So now instead of a bunch of $1.2 million homes, he's building a bunch of pretty nice, much smaller homes, multiple homes to a lot for something in the 400s, low to mid 400s per home, which is much, much, much cheaper than any new construction in these comparable low density areas in Portland today. He's got 70 units in the pipeline and was really excited about this new round of changes that's going to make it easier for him to keep scaling up. And I think that's a great sign for hopefully other folks will follow his work. I mentioned these tweaks that are coming into effect in a couple weeks. Another one was that I remember the sort of 6 unit per lot if they meet affordability standards. I showed a photo of the 3 stories of 2. This time we also allowed a bunch of sideways plexes to do 6 units on a lot if they meet affordability standards again. And one thing this offers is front porches and front doors. There's a lot of research here in Portland that found that folks who are being targeted by these for these, get homes through these policies had a really strong preference for not being able to say, that's my building, but rather saying, that's my door, that's my porch, that's my home. I'll close before I take questions with this quote that I love from a woman who lives in a neighborhood like this. This was submitted as testimony when the state was considering the bill. I do not like the changes that have happened to my neighborhood. When I moved into my home 18 years ago, I moved into a block filled with young families. It is hard to picture now, but there was a time when our neighborhood was affordable for working class people. I think that's a really lovely reminder of the fact that we cannot choose whether or not change happens. Change is going to happen. What we can choose is which kind of change we get. Thanks very much for your time, and I'd love to take any questions starting now.
Thank you, Michael. So yeah, please let me know in the chat if you have a question. The first one is from M. Gibson. I have a question, sorry, just moving it. I have a question regarding parking. In our smaller municipality, we don't have transit options, but we do have housing affordability and supply issues. Does Michael have any solutions examples in this instance?
Sure. And I actually think that's, I mean, it's a super common situation. Many parts of Portland, people will tell you, oh, our transit here is terrible, and they're right. It's never going to be convenient in many parts, even of a big city like Portland, to live without a car. Like it is in, in parts of Toronto, it is actually pretty convenient. In most of North America, it's not. The question is, are we actually going to make it illegal for people to try and find ways to do that? Ultimately, when we're saying you're not allowed to have this home unless you assume that you need this car, you have to provide the off-site parking space even if you don't need it. We're saying not only is that necessary now, it's also going to be necessary in 10 years when this building is still here, and in 40 years when this building is probably still here, and so on. You're making a guess from miles away about the future of a neighborhood when you say you have to have parking spaces on site. Well, I think many cities are doing, and this is the case in more and more parts of both the United States and Canada, is we're not going to prevent people from building parking spaces if they want to, but we're going to allow neighborhoods to gradually evolve if they can. So that's what removing a parking mandate does. I do think it's like going to be a higher payoff if you do that in places where it's easier to live without a car. So like you can get a few people living without a car in some neighborhoods, and that'll create some more services, and that'll snowball hopefully. But the effect of the mandate is to prevent the evolution. And so I think we should be focused on the gradual evolution and making it possible. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my way of thinking about it.
Okay. Next question is from Jill. I have a question about heat island effect and stormwater management and how Portland addressed maintaining green space during this type of intensification. Is there a bylaw for green roofs?
Yeah, we've got a separate rule for green roofs, and we've got incentives for like, you pay a lower stormwater impact fee if you have a green roof, or can reduce the amount of impervious surface on your lot. That wasn't bundled into this sort of stuff. One consideration that was sort of mixed into this conversation was how much lot coverage is allowed. So that's one of the many zoning rules and one of the constraints. So it's a legitimate trade-off. I don't know the state of the law in Canada. In the States, there's quite a lot of mitigation required to reduce runoff. Obviously, it doesn't always work, and you do what you can. But the like the Clean Water Act in the States mandate sort of starts to bite around the same time as zoning mandates, and so like the zoning mandates actually sort of simplify that issue. Um, the other thing I often think about with green space is that like it is undeniable. Trees are fantastic. Urban trees are terrific, and the just having places to walk your dog, to play with your kid outside, a really important thing. I don't think it's most efficient. Like the most efficient way to do that isn't to require everybody in a certain neighborhood to have that for themselves, right? Certainly people should be able to own their own yard if they want to, but to say you're not allowed to live in this neighborhood unless you purchase a yard, unless you have space for a tree that may or may not exist, I don't think that's like the most efficient way to do it. I think the parks are a pretty efficient way to do it, and having a bunch of urban parkland is more economically feasible and benefits a lot more people if you have more housing near the parkland. One of my priorities, sort of in the longer term in Portland, is to tie more of our sort of zoning allowances to proximity to parkland, because I feel like that's like a ton of public resources are invested in our parks, and allowing more people to live across the street from those parks seems like a really efficient way to improve not just the number of people who can access the parks, but even the fun of being in a park.
Okay, next question is from Wendy Burton. Did the state law provide, one, any help for cities that needed to upgrade infrastructure to support intensification, and two, any allowance to prioritize intensification along transit routes?
We started out in Portland doing a bunch of like calculations about, is this close enough to transit for this or that? And I'm sorry, I didn't. Is this text on the here? I might have missed some of your thing for
It
us.
is, yeah. So did the state law provide, one, any
Yeah, oh,
help
I
for
see it now
cities?
from
Yeah.
Wendy. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. The So yeah, the state law did not specify transit routes as priority areas, and the local implementation did consider using that in their calculations and decided ultimately that that wasn't worth it. That it wasn't worth saying, hey, homeowners further from transit, you don't get the same allowances that people close to transit do, because that sort of has equity implications as well. The uh, there we are currently going through another round of conversations at the state level about where larger buildings should go, and I think it's very likely that those will be corresponding more to transit routes of a certain quality. And there's also reducing parking mandates at the state level, which I think is going to be partly linked to transit. Like the current proposal removes parking mandates within a half mile of 15-minute headway transit routes. Um, so there's some of that. In terms of like the infrastructure needed to support intensification, I think again there's a difference here between the like big apartment buildings that like, oh no, this is gonna like screw up the sewer system, and a few plexes here and there. Like the fact is that at least in the States, I assume in Canada, household sizes have been falling for decades on average in almost every location. There are not as many flushes of toilets, and the toilet flushes are much more efficient than they used to be. A few replacements of one plexes with fourplexes in a large city is not going to be a big difference in the sewer infrastructure. So I think the state assumed that that's going to come out in the wash. It's going to be payable with impact fees and subscription fees and property taxes and so on. So uh, there wasn't any direct link to that, though that is the case in some edge cases. I think that there are some cities that do have like a specifically a water and sewer capacity issue. Um, the state provides various grants for that. The folks in the cities say it's not enough. They're probably right. I don't know. The other infrastructure things like the roadways, there's actually a special exemption put into our Oregon law that said you don't, for these middle housing up to the first 4 units, you don't have to calculate whether it's going to throw roadways into failure, by which failure is defined as delay at the intersection, like cars not moving as fast. And part of that thinking is that with transportation, what matters to the consumer isn't really how fast is my vehicle moving on my way to my destination. It's like, how long does it take me to get to my destination, right? And when we prioritize how fast the vehicle's moving by adding turn lanes and preventing infill, like we're actually lengthening the distance that it takes to travel to our destinations. And so it's not only forcing us into cars because we're taking longer trips, but it's also like lengthening every one of those car trips, which sort of defeats the purpose of the intended purpose of moving to your destination quickly. So it's a difference between access and mobility. Mobility being about speed, access being about getting where you want to go. And I'm very much in favor of the idea that we should be, I guess, worrying less about building enough streets to support people and more about managing the streets that we have and making sure that that space is used most efficiently while allowing people to live close to each other, as they did back when our relatively transit friendly, walkable, bikeable cores were built before zoning.
Great. Linda Lukasik writes, wow, thanks so much for your presentation, Michael. There's even more innovative stuff happening in Oregon than I realized. I wonder, in cities like Portland, what has the uptake been like in the development community where building affordable and accessible units are concerned? Is the residential infill policy working effectively to bring more of these units into being?
Yeah. So uh, I'll separate the affordability and accessibility questions. Is it accessibility? Do I take that to be about disability and ability access or universal access, or is that more about affordability?
I'm assuming if Linda, if you want to unmute yourself and address that, that'd be great, or you can drop it in the chat.
Yeah, just quickly, just the physical accessibility.
Okay, yeah, great. So I mentioned that they put in what's called a visitability standard on the third and fourth units in our rezoning. So that requires the no step entry and I think wider doorways. It doesn't reach, there are two different levels of accessibility standard in the states. Beyond that, and it doesn't, like, it's outside the scope of zoning, of local zoning apparently, to set a higher accessibility standard than visitability. So to get to what the federal government would consider an accessible standard under our Americans with Disabilities Act, it doesn't trigger until the fourth unit. So one of the arguments we made for allowing 4 units was that it actually gets you to that federal standard, which kicks in separately from local zoning, that says any ground floor units on in a fourplex have to meet that higher federal accessibility standard, which means a bigger bathroom and a few other things. So generally speaking, I feel like the flexibility to have multiple units on a lot is a pretty big win for accessibility, simply because you you can have at least any ground floor units can actually be accessible without having to be fully accessible, without having to be one story as a building. And you're never going to be able to build a new one-story building, one-story, one-unit building in a desirable area these days. So the way to get one floor, one unit structures is to allow them to stack. And that's one thing that allowing plexes does. This is, I think, not something that the market can easily solve, because there's this huge demand for accessible housing that is going to be materializing in the next few years as boomers hit the years when we humans are more likely to be disabled. So the market will respond to that in the way that people will be unable to afford accessible housing because it'll be scarce. But the market is not going to be able to anticipate that unless humans suddenly become better at coming to terms with their own aging. So I do think there's a strong role for government in helping people come to terms with their own aging where we can. Franz, I think you're on mute.
Next question is from Kevin Thomason. Great presentation, Michael. Are there any mistakes in Portland or the West Coast that we can avoid and learn from? Is there anything that really caught you by surprise the past few years?
Yeah, there are a few things. Thanks I love to talk about how we screw everything up. I think the biggest concession that I wish it hadn't been necessary to make in Portland was capping building size. I talked about the political benefits of being able to say you're against McMansions, which is true. I don't like McMansions. I don't think we should be spending $1 zillion on them. But it also, just as with all these housing questions, banning the structure doesn't ban the existence of the person who wants the big house. Ultimately, the only thing we can do in a world where there are many different kinds of people with many different types of resources is to allow more options for more people, right? Like we need to get out of the scarcity mindset of like that person is hurting me by existing and get into an abundance mindset of like we can live together. So more practically, less theoretically, the effect of that ban on large structures, especially of large multi-unit structures, larger fourplexes, is that it greatly reduced the rate at which we could actually build these things. I showed you that chart of like which homes would be plausible to redevelop, and the fourplexes on most lots in Portland, it's completely financially infeasible. Even if, a lot is in the unicorn situation where it's got a seller who's, interested in, in moving off the place, and there isn't a buyer immediately who wants to pay top dollar for the existing structure, or maybe the structure is at the end of its useful life or whatever. Once in a while, when that happens, it redevelops. The ability of a city to keep evolving and infilling these new options is completely dependent on that roll of the dice every time a property sells, right? It's like maybe it's going to work out this time. And so the bigger we allow a building to be, the more we spin those dice toward coming up to be multiple units rather than just the status quo. There are downsides of bigger units. We talked about green space. We talked about like the price of new homes when they're built, and larger homes are more expensive. I think the better way to deal with the larger homes are more expensive thing is to allow more households to team up to allow 8 plexes or whatever, apartment buildings in more of the city. But I wish we hadn't had to impose that structure cap. It was essentially a concession to the NIMBYs that had the effect that they wanted, which was to deter infill housing, specifically in the richest neighborhoods in the city. So like specifically in the most desirable areas, that's where the marginal square foot is most valuable, and therefore that's where the effect of that building cap bit hardest on any other possibilities except the status quo. So that's one big thing. I think our code is getting much more complicated, and as we layer on, this thing and that thing and the other, every time you make a change, there's both a temptation to like make a bunch of changes, and there's also like maybe similarly, just the other side of that coin is the danger of like fiddling with things too much, like micromanaging too much, and so it's quite complicated to use the Portland code right now. I hope that in a few years we'll be able to simplify some of it, consolidate some of the definitions, make it easier for any Joe or Jane Schmo to see what is possible on their land, and hopefully, therefore, make it easier for normal people to use. I think so. That's something that I wish we're in more conversations. Is like, do we really need this rule? Is this like, what's the benefit of this additional little detail? And in terms of like things that surprised me, something that like I wish I had thought before we did this was I've spent so much of the last 5 years of my life using the words duplex, triplex, fourplex, and like it hadn't really occurred to me that like why don't we just let them be detached from each other? That implies that they're physically attached to each other, and that implies in many cases demolition to take advantage of any of this. Why can't we just reduce lot sizes? Why can't we just say, oh, your lot size can be smaller than it used to be able to? That's actually what Houston did in a two-step reform in 1998, 2013. Reduced their lot size by 66% or so. And they've had a ton of townhouse development through there. And Houston is the United States' most affordable boomtown today. So I don't love everything about Houston. The sprawl is terrible, but there's a lot of lessons we can learn from the infill. The liberals in Houston live in Houston itself, and they've come up with a pretty good system for allowing much more infill than any other city in the States.
Okay. Question from Eb Gibson, which I'm really looking forward to hear your answer. Can you talk about the uptake in building these types of units since the policies were implemented? Have you seen a greater appetite for this type of development from developers?
Yeah. So this is something that like a lot of people are asking right now, and I'm sort of desperately trying to gather information about right now. I just over the last week I wrote a piece about that question, talking to various home builders who are trying to take advantage of this stuff. We've had between the 1st of August last year when it took effect and the first day of February, or possibly the last day of February, I forget, is something on the order of 100 homes taking advantage of the new zoning. So that's not a ton, but it's also not nothing. So Minneapolis allowed triplexes a few years ago citywide, and I think they saw a grand total of like 6 triplexes since then. So that was because they set a very small maximum building size for throughout their low density zones, and so it doesn't make economic sense to build these triplexes in almost any case. I think that from talking to these builders and just looking at the numbers, I think this next round of tweaks that is going to take effect on July 1st is going to somewhat accelerate the pace of building. Right now we're at about 12 units a month or something on average, and I think, I don't know, maybe it'll double or triple over the course of a few years. A lot of the obstacle for a builder is loans. Home building is a super capital intensive industry because all of the expenses basically are up front before you can make any revenue. So it is heavily dependent on getting loan products, and that's a huge obstacle here because, especially in the case of like a low density home with an existing structure where there's a mortgage on the structure that you don't own free and clear, the bank does not let you sell off part of that lot to anybody unless it gets its share of, making itself whole. So it can be a complicated loan puzzle, and the big banks haven't found it worth their while to figure out how to make this work for ordinary people because it's just too small of a share of the market because it's illegal almost everywhere. So now that various jurisdictions, including California, have now legalized multifamily structures, small multifamily structures on almost every lot. I think that we're going to see various lenders and other institutions coming up with products that will be able to be used not only by professional builders, but by ordinary folks, and that will help a lot along these things. President Biden just a few weeks ago issued an executive order for our federally chartered loan buyer corporations, Fannie and Freddie, to start sort of rewriting rules to take advantage of 2 to 4plexes, and I think that'll help. Anyway, at the moment, there's like 3 or 4 companies that are pretty excited about this zoning and are really jumping into it head first. And as long as they survive the dive, I think they will find some followers, but we'll see.
Yeah. Well, we are coming to the end of our hour. That went really fast. Today's webinar, along with some of the resources Michael mentioned, will be available on the OGA website in coming days. And when it's ready, I'll send all of you an email about that. But before we sign off, I first of all want to say thank you to Michael for a very thoughtful and presentation and remarks. And I would like to invite all of you to visit the OGA website at www.greenbeltalliance.ca, where you can find a variety of resources about planning in greenbelt-friendly ways. You can also find the recordings of the first 2 webinars in this series at the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance YouTube page. Also, if you have any follow-up questions to Michael that come to you afterwards, just send me an email and I will forward them to Michael, and you can connect with him and go from there. And finally, to those of you who have joined us for the first time, we hope that today is the beginning of an ongoing dialogue, which will lead us towards a future where your local needs are met in a way that helps our Greenbelt. So with that, thank you so much for all of you for attending. Thank you, Michael, and take care. Bye-bye.